The idea of a steady state economy is most widely associated with Herman Daly, who certainly originated the term. But actually the idea of a steady state as an end point of economic growth goes back very much further. It was anticipated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, by John Stuart Mill, and indeed by Keynes. Smith in The Wealth of Nations said that growth could possibly be sustained for 200 years, but that would be it. Mill and indeed Keynes, Smith's view was rather a pessimistic one, but Mill and Keynes certainly viewed this as a positive thing. Mill said the stationary state of capital and wealth would be a very considerable improvement on our present condition. Keynes, writing in the 30s at the height of the Depression, anticipated a time when we would have enough, so we wouldn't need to grow anymore, that we could set aside the questions of economics and get on with our lives, with what mattered in life. So they both saw this as a positive rather than a negative thing. Over the last 20 or 30 years, well, since Herman Daly, but particularly perhaps over the last 10 or 20 years, with growing concerns about climate change especially, the concept of a steady state economy, whether or not under that name, has gained increasing traction. We now have a Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. We have a degrowth movement. We have a campaign for a transition economy towards a steady state economy, or as some of its adherents, such as our former colleague Andrew Sims, prefers to call it a dynamic equilibrium economy, which I think is perhaps a little more complex than it needs to be. So why? Well, this is probably stating the obvious, but essentially it's about the environmental constraints to economic production and consumption. An assessment of global ecosystems in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2003 found that 15 out of the 24 global ecosystems that they considered were being degraded or used unsustainably. The majority of major global ecosystem services were being used unsustainably. The global ecological footprint is now 40% above, estimated to be 40% above the Earth's biocapacity as of 2006. And it hasn't got any better since 2006. Climate change, if we're going to sustain global growth at its pre-crisis rate over the previous 20 years or so in the global economy, we are going to have to reduce the amount of carbon we emit per dollar of per real dollar of global output by something in excess of 95%. So what we currently do with $20 of 20 barrels of oil, we need to do with 1 barrel of oil. Then, apart from that, you then have the issue of peak oil. Known oil reserves will last something in the order of 25 years. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty either side of that. What's less widely known, or less widely considered, is how much longer our other mineral resources will last. If the growth rate of consumption of mineral resources continues at the rate of the last 20 years before the crisis, and we can continue to discover new resources of minerals at the same rate as we did over that period, most minerals will run out sometime between about 2020 and 2060 in terms of the resources which are commercially exploitable at current prices. There will still be more in the ground, but prices are going to have to go up a lot in order to make them commercially viable. For a long time, Smith's idea that we could continue growing for 200 years and that would be it was dismissed. but it's beginning to look as though maybe 200 years, writing in 1776, wasn't quite so far off after all. Now, there are two dimensions if we're going to consider a steady-state economy. These are the limits I've been talking about have essentially been global environmental limits, the global ecosystem. So do we need a global steady-state economy? But we are reaching those limits almost entirely because of northern overconsumption, which raises the second question, do we need national steady-state economies in the north? These are two quite different things. Now, I'm going to start off talking about northern economies, essentially with reference to the UK, but more or less applies to other economies as well. And then I'm going to return to the question of the global economy. Now, the key feature, of course, of a steady-state economy at the national level is that it doesn't grow over the long term, at least. It may fluctuate, but it broadly maintains a constant level over the long term of production and consumption. But that isn't the be-all and end-all of it, because if the economy isn't growing, that imposes two constraints. It limits your imports to the amount that you export, and it limits your public spending to your taxation. Why? Because in order to run a balance of payments deficit or a budget deficit, you need to borrow money. If you borrow money, you accumulate debt. So if you are doing that on a continuous basis over the long term, you accumulate more and more debt, which inevitably, ultimately, will outpace, because your economy isn't growing, your capacity to pay that debt isn't growing. So at some point, it will become unsustainable, sooner or later. Now, these are long-term aggregate constraints. We're talking about long-term growth. We're talking about the long-term balance of payments, the long-term budget deficit. You may run deficits in the short term, you may grow in the short term. But if you run deficits in the short term now, then they will need to be offset by surpluses in the future. If you grow now, because the concept is of a steady state, growth now will need to be offset by the shrinkage of production and consumption later on. It's also important to say that, and this is the reason why some people prefer to use the term dynamic equilibrium rather than steady state, that it's not static in the sense of always being the same, because patterns of consumption, patterns of demand will change, technologies will change, and the economy needs to respond to those changes. So the composition of consumption and therefore the composition of production will need to change. It's the overall level that is seen as staying constant. So should we aspire to a steady-state national economy in the North? Well, in principle, yes. We in the North are largely, if not wholly, responsible, in some cases, for exhausting the global ecosystem. I'll say a bit more about that later on. But it is not so simple as it might at first sound. It's not just about stopping growth. And that links into the second question. Not just should we do it, but could we do it? So I'm just going to sort of zip through some of the problems. The first, and in some ways the most serious, I think, is, I don't know, it depends how you view it really. It depends what you mean by. Is the internal contradictions in a steady-state economy, in economies as we understand them. If you were designing something to sit on, you wouldn't design something that looked like a bicycle. You would design something that looked like an armchair. No, something that you want to move in is very different from something you want to sit still in. A capitalist economy is like a bicycle. Without momentum, it falls over. The basis of a capitalist economy is capital accumulation. Investment creates profit, profit creates investment, and as that cycle proceeds, so the the stock of growth grows exponentially, and that growth of the capital stock fuels, the growth of the capital stock then fuels growth. So the profit provides resources for investment, it creates incentives for investment, the investment generates more profits, and the investment increases the stock of capital in the economy. So far, so good. Question is, can we have continuous capital accumulation in a steady state economy without economic growth? Well, without economic growth, if you have your stock of capital increasing continuously at an exponential rate, while the size of the economy itself, the income in the economy, the consumption, the production are static, then you have a lily pond effect. So, as capital grows, it will inevitably squeeze out the incomes of other factors of production, and particularly of labour. So you will get ever greater capital intensity in production, ever fewer jobs, ever greater inequality and poverty. I would argue that we need to increase labour intensity, not to reduce it. I'm thinking of starting a neo-Luddite movement, but that's possibly taking things a little far.